This is Derby, and it's supposed to be the headquarters of the brand new Great British Railways. In all the discussion about what GBR is going to be, there's been a lot of criticism about the failures of the current proposals, where the gaps are, what people think is going to go wrong, and how it compares to the previous models. What we haven't seen is a single coherent view of what GBR should be. That is exactly what we're going to be looking at tonight. As ever, if you want to arm yourself with the tools to make transport better, then joining the Patreon for £5 a month is a great place to start, giving you the free audiobook of How the Rails Will Fix the Future, as well as access to the weekly bonus episode with the full back catalogue, adding a big chunk to the RailNatter canon. Go to patreon.com/Gareth Dennis. By looking at an idealised structure for GBR, we can compare it to what's being proposed right now in Parliament, understand where those gaps are, and therefore what needs to change to allow Britain's railways to thrive. Everyone, welcome to tonight's RailNatter. And as the Intercity 225 fades away, we know that GBR is coming, and as we found out earlier this week, with Heidi Alexander remaining in post, and as I believe is her junior ministerial team, that means that GBR is remaining firmly on the same trajectory as it has been for nearly 2 years now. This is troubling, because there are shortcomings, some of them existential, with the structure and powers of the new organisation. Tonight's episode is split into two halves. In the first half, we'll look at my view of the ideal GBR and its relationship with the bodies and organisations around it. In the second, we'll be having a chat with Joanna Grew, Strategy Director for both GWR and the Western route of Network Rail. In doing so, we'll see how much of what the new GBR is purported to enable has already been happening successfully for a decade or more. Equally usefully, though, we'll remind ourselves what railways can enable and the challenges in the way of unlocking that capability. Burnham is PM, and on Monday I released a video going into the top 5 things he should prioritise. What was first on that list? Oh, it's reducing the bus fare cap. What did he do literally today? Reduce the bus fare cap, albeit not by as much as he should have. The 3 recommendations made in the first of my top 5s came from this report by the NEF. The New Economics Foundation, in which there's a load of useful and interesting data around rail that I've supported Paula and Alex with. This is the first NEF report I've been mentioned in as well, not quite co-author, but a data wrangler in any case. We might well go through this in detail for a future RailNatter bonus. The one key frustration for rail fare policy, though, as I was kind of going through this data and as we were working on these policies, was that, other than the complexity of the entire rail industry, and particularly in terms of rail fares and ticketing, is the utter mess that constitutes our passenger operators. Sort of the smooshed up mess that they form. It's a mess that GBR intends to fully retain exactly as it is. So if we're going to talk about how we could carve the ideal GBR out of the current railway industry, it makes sense, I think, to start there. Here is the rail industry as it was in the rail industry structure episode we did a while back. Chaos, right? Lots of chaos. So the operators, the passenger operators specifically, we already know a few things about passenger operations in GB. So we know that we have got the operators that are being subsumed or have already been subsumed into GBR, and we've got the non-GBR operators. Those are ScotRail, CalSleeper, the TFW, Transport for Wales services, and then the open access operators, which are Eurostar, Grand Central, Heathrow Express, Hull Trains, and Lumo. Let's start with the flagship of any passenger railway operation, Intercity, the long-distance, high-speed Intercity services, and this should be a visibly different service to other trains. It should not be branded the same as the other operators. It should be, or operator, it should be a clear, bright, I think white and blue is quite a good colour, identity. To be honest, turn the LNER livery blue, and that's not far off what I think those trains should look like, But it doesn't really matter hugely what the actual livery on the trains is. The identity of the Intercity service should be distinct from other services. And how we build those, how we build Intercity from the current range is that it makes no sense to continue to have separate Intercity operators around the country. It doesn't make any sense. It should be a single unified, this is the fast way I get from here from where I am to any of the other major cities. It's the high-speed core running on, currently busy mixed traffic, but eventually they'll be running on dedicated high-speed lines, and in some cases might well run on new bypass routes or segregated 4-track railways. There are things that Intercity should and can be doing, but what about the wholesale sort of transfer of the existing operators over? Because, okay, for LNER, Avanti West Coast and the related West Coast Partnership franchise that it's a part of, Hull Trains, ideally in Grand Central, those run services that I think ought to be run by the incumbent. There should be Hull services that are Intercity trains. And Grand Central running up to the northeast, particularly its services up to Middlesbrough and Sunderland, should be run by the incumbent. Those can all be transferred, or equivalent services in the case of the open operators, run wholesale into the Intercity organisation. But Transpennine, Cross Country, Greater Anglia EMR, GWR, South Western and South Eastern also all run Intercity services, but they do not make up the majority of their operations. So Transpennine, kind of in order of how much of them gets subsumed across, to be honest, Transpennine Express, the majority of its Intercity services, because yes, Newcastle, Leeds, Manchester and Liverpool are major cities, as are Edinburgh and Glasgow. Those are Intercity services they're running. They should be transferred into an Intercity operation. Across country, it's long distance, high speed services. The trains that can go up to 125 miles an hour are Intercity trains. And good grief, is there an episode on Cross Country to talk about how much longer those trains should be and how they could be the premier long distance service with catering and experiences and bike storage and family facilities to match. EMR, all those fast services that have currently been decimated up and down the middle main line, those are Intercity services, should be branded as such. GWR, all the stuff going out along the Great Western, Intercity services. South Western Railway running its services down to Southampton, those are Intercity services, albeit they are running on third rail technology. But they are Intercity services and should be treated as such. Strongly believe that, and they should be quite clear which are the Intercity services and which are then not the Intercity services, which are suburban, etc., etc. And then South Eastern runs the Javelin. That is a high-speed train running on a proper dedicated high-speed line and should be treated as an Intercity service accordingly. And that means that those all get snarled up. So LNER, Avanti, easy, wholesale. The others get snarled up, leaving bits of them behind as you transfer across into forming the new Intercity organisation. But what about infrastructure and strategic planning? Network Rail has a, this isn't all of Network Rail, but it has a route structure. All the main lines that carry Intercity services, that is those that link up Britain's major cities over long distances and at speeds over 100 miles an hour, should be subsumed into the Intercity organisation. Should not be separate infrastructure and train operator. They should be subsumed into the same organisation. There are functions within Network Rail that go across those routes. This is a hopeless diagram. It's impossible to find any good diagrams of the actual structure, publicly anyway, the actual structure of Network Rail in totality. But you've got the routes, but also you've got parts of functions of the organisation that go across the routes. Property and stations, certainly some of that would go to the Intercity organisation. Elements of those, there are bits of Network Rail that do not sit in the routes would need to go into the Intercity organisation as well. So our Intercity organisation would include those passenger operators either gobbled up entirely or partially. It would include those Network Rail high-speed routes, those Intercity routes, enabling the Intercity organisation to then optimise those to maximise mode shift. Those would be the East Coast Main Line cross-country route, West Coast Main Line, Midland Main Line, Great Western Main Line, Transpennine route, Great Eastern Main Line, the South West Main Line. Network Rail High Speed, as well as an organisation, would be subsumed into Intercity. And then the national passenger operators, it's kind of NPFO, it's part of the organisation that thinks about national passenger operations, would also get subsumed into this body. But we also need to eat HS2, as it is currently, eat HS2 and turn it into the Intercity organisation, but therefore thinking about new high-speed lines into the future, but as part of the overall picture of Intercity operations, not as a self-contained thing off on its own, but as an integrated part of planning for the best mode share for rail overall as possible. So that's Intercity, the flagship of GBR's passenger operations and a self-contained operation that will strive to maximise rail's long-distance passenger mode share. To do this, it would work across national borders in Wales, Scotland and England, although only owning infrastructure within England. But what about the rest of passenger operations? We've got a load of operators still here, either partially or wholly left over, that we have not subsumed. And this is where we need to think about the structure of government in England. So we know that we've got, UK-wide government, fine. We know that we've got the devolved governments in Wales and Scotland. England doesn't have its own devolved government. What it does have is strategic authorities. Those are either, city regions or some of these other kind of urban or peri-urban areas that have been kind of decided to group themselves into strategic authority, or in some cases largely rural areas that have decided to group themselves into strategic authority. But what about those areas not within a strategic authority, or perhaps not within a strategic authority that's willing or capable to coordinate its own integrated services? In Ireland, public transport operations are integrated under the Irish National Transport Authority, and it operates bus and rail services under the integrated public-facing TfI brand, as seen modelled here on a bus stop, with Irish Rail and Irish Bus doing the actual service operation. It sits under the Irish Department of Transport, but has significant autonomy and powers, and it can direct both Irish Bus and Irish Rail to do things that it needs to do as the NTA to achieve the objectives set for it by the DOT. Sound good? Sure. But what would this look like for Britain? Well, Wales and Scotland already have transport as their own devolved concerns, albeit Wales needs more powers handing to it. And that leaves England. So England needs a new body. Transport for England. It would subsume Active Travel England and Sustrans. It would subsume all of the bus and local transport functions of the DFT. It would integrate ticketing and branding of existing private bus operations outside of strategic authorities, and would eventually become the state bus operator as we begin the critical task of ending private bus operations and reversing decades of cuts and poor service. And it would become the leader organisation for GBR, becoming a primary stakeholder in the new intercity organisation alongside Transport Scotland and Transport for Wales, but most expansively, becoming the integrated brand for all public transport across England outside of the major cities or strategic authorities with their own branding and identity. There'll be more on Transport for England in a future episode, but for now, what it gives us is a single regional operator for non-intercity rail operations, and trains would be branded as such. This is where the existing NR route structure off the main lines would then come in. So you potentially retain some of this route structure underneath GBR Regional. Of course, you'd see further elements of Network Rail getting integrated into GBR Regional at the same time that some of the strategic elements, such as the system operator, would at least partially be integrated into the umbrella body that would work across modes to integrate bus, train, and active travel. That would be Transport for England. So what would this then leave us? We've got we've got most of them on the board now would become part of GBR Regional, but we would exclude from that, West Midlands, the kind of the urban operator of trains in Birmingham and the West Midlands. We would exclude Merseyrail from that as the urban operator for Liverpool City region. We would obviously be excluding the devolved operators. Heathrow Express, either by leaving it as it is and letting it die when it gets defeated by better and better TfL services, or by eating it with TfL. Heathrow Express isn't one we're going to worry about. Lumo, leave it as it is, or regulate it out of existence, not too important. And Eurostar, fair enough, leave Eurostar as it is. I hope to see more open access operators running on High Speed 1 soon. So that basically tackles, that gives us the range of operators. Of course, GTR in that, as well as South Western Railway, as well as Greater Anglia. Lots of those services, potentially a lot of C2C, are urban and suburban services that actually ought to be transferred to the strategic authority, well, actually not to a strategic authority, to TfL as it stands. If you remember back to episode 114, this was the structure we proposed. We had intercity, we had regional, and then we had all of the urban operators, fine. Rather than only thinking about the final tier, we've gone beyond this, by the way, now that's what this episode's all about. Rather than thinking only about the final tier of operations as urban only, we may as well align them with the new strategic authorities, as one size doesn't really fit all. For example, in the case of Transport for Cornwall, which should be empowered to jointly brand trains alongside GBR Regional and in place of Transport for England. However, the aim should be for all of England's city regions to have an integrated operation that prioritises unified identity over the GBR brand. TfL is the exemplar here, really, with the overground and with all of its integrated modes. The B network is emerging. Nexus, with the Tyne Metro and others, has not really been allowed to use its unified brand, but I hope that will roll out to a greater extent with the increased level of devolution going to that strategic authority. Merseytravel, of course, Liverpool City region, does integrate across some of its modes, though it needs to integrate across more of them. And the West Midlands, I think, West Midlands Railway is part of the wider West Midlands transport system, and I think that works really bloody well. In fact, it's an exemplar, I would say, of what the stations should look like, because they don't need to even nod to the GBR identity other than having the double arrow at the totem of the station. People know the double arrow, they recognise the double arrow, but actually the station is part of the integrated West Midlands transport system, run by Transport for the West Midlands. That is brilliant. It is a fantastic identity. It looks like it is being done less well for the emerging Weaver network. I accept that operations are going to be mixed at stations where you have regional services calling as well as the urban services, but the identity of the urban operator should not be so deprioritised. And we'll be talking a bit more about that balance in tonight's bonus. We'll be flicking through version 1.0 of the wayfinding guidelines for GBR as they currently stand, and as released by an FOI request by a watcher of the show. Hello Gareth, how are you doing? There's lots to learn from these about the balance between centralisation and devolution, and I'm afraid it doesn't look so good at this point. And as someone who's really championed devolution, will this man change that direction? As I mentioned earlier, my top 5 transport tasks for Burnham to prioritise went out in a video on Monday, so you can go find that and see what you think. So we've established intercity, we've established regional, and in both cases as more than just a rebrand of an existing train operator. These autonomous organisations would fight to increase rail mode share according with the targets set by DFT, working together to segregate their services and maximise capacity and journey times with new tracks and trains. We've also determined that in some cases there would be a transfer wholesale of operations to the cities and their strategic authorities to align them much more closely to TfL, and TfL itself would take over more services. This should be more than just stickers on trains though. Ideally this would look to be a transfer wholesale of infrastructure and trains, or at least the leasing of them from GBR Regional. Across the board too, we will need to see trains being procured directly by Intercity and Regional, or on behalf of the strategic authorities where they are not sufficiently capable of achieving this themselves. All of these services would be operated underneath a new authority, Transport for England, integrating all modes outside of the cities for better rural and peri-urban travel. It would achieve this alongside Transport Scotland and Trafnidiaeth Cymru. But where does that leave the rest of the rail industry? Are we finished? There's a lot still on screen right now. So, we've done the operators, the passenger operators, we've done High Speed 2. I would argue that East West Rail would need to see the same level of integration into GBR Regional. We have looked to integrate functions of the DFT into TFE, likewise RDG, and some of the stuff within the kind of the shadow or transition GBR organisation would actually be transferred into Transport for England. Network Rail, I think we've almost entirely dissolved, but not quite. There's a couple of things outstanding. The rail regulator, what is its role in this new shape? I would say decidedly scant, frankly. EDF, you might be going, wait, what? EDF? The new rail organisation should be empowered to generate its own electricity. However it takes that process, whether it buys land and buys solar panels or whatever it happens to do, but it should be empowered to do that. The trade bodies stay as they are, local authorities, unions stay as they are, the universities, colleges, RIB absolutely stays where it is. YRP, NSAR, the other bodies. I would argue perhaps that RSSB maybe would benefit from being going somewhere else. But anyway, even if we left those as they are, there's still quite a lot that we have not resolved, not least freight. Look, as I see it, there are 2 remaining major elements of the railway organisation that we need to round out: GBR Freight and GBR Engineering. GBR Freight would largely be what is currently direct rail services, DRS, it's state-owned, but by DESNES, not DFT, weirdly, but with intentionally expand its remit to support itself and the other freight operators to widen rail's modal share for goods movement. So, GBR Freight wouldn't just be DRS, it would also be the freight functions of Network Rail to ensure that we're maximising deployment of freight, rail freight across the board, supporting the open access freight operators, essentially, but achieving those targets set by DFT and the Railways Bill. It would also take over ownership of freight infrastructure assets, such as sidings, rail freight interchanges, those freight-only lines potentially. It would take ownership of that infrastructure. GBR Engineering, however, would be the body that sweeps up everything left on the table from Network Rail Route Services, Network Rail Engineering Services, IT, National Signalling Functions, the Technical Authority, all into a single, unified lead organisation. It would also unify engineering functions that were damagingly split by region, such as high output renewals and other pan-national functions, while the former routes would have been grouped under GBR Regional, potentially retaining that kind of regional structure, but that's kind of by the by, essentially. This is where the rolling programs come in, because as we went through in episode 305, the lion's share of GBR Engineering's work would be instigating programs of electrification, resignaling, training, and so much more, a pace and efficiency simply not achievable at a project or route scale. It's not all about trains either. Eventually, the functions of the Roscoes, such as fleet engineering, would go into GBR engineering, as well as a range of train and technology-related functions. Much more design would be centralised into GBR engineering as well, avoiding the daft dance of the consultancies around work that has no benefit of being delivered externally. GBRX, no matter where it ends up, into GBR engineering it goes. Both the freight and engineering bits of GBR would have a remit across Scotland, England and Wales as required by the devolved authorities. Given the benefits of scale, both Scotland and Wales would be able to reap from tapping into a GB-wide body. GBR Engineering would also carry out work on behalf of GBR in City and GBR Regional and GBR Freight as instructed. So this gives us GBR. This gives us the subsidiary organisations underneath the holding group. We've essentially created our own series of sectors that would sit under the umbrella GBR body. HR and finance functions should be set at the sector levels, not at the holding body level. All of this would be in aid of maximising what public transport can deliver with rail right at its heart. But what can an integrated railway achieve? What does it look like? This is where our chat with Joe Grew comes in. Joe, thanks so much for joining me. First of all, for anyone who might not know who you are, Joe, would you be able to introduce yourself and briefly sort of tell us what you do within the railway organisation?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Gareth, for having me today. So I'm Joe Grew. I'm, I think, I'm going to say it, the first Joint Route Strategy Director for the industry. So that's for Great Western Railways and for Network Rail, and I report into both executive teams for the Great Western patch. So that's really exciting. What does it mean? Because I'm not really sure that job titles tell you very much, but effectively I am leading on the strategic investment for both organisations as we move towards public ownership and then GBR. And I've got a joint team that covers off both Great Western colleagues and Network Rail colleagues, and we are working up what we want the network to look like, both now in the short term, medium term, and then way into the future, 30 years time. So we're going out and we're talking to stakeholders, we're talking to local authorities, we're talking to mayoral combined authorities. We are then looking at what our passenger demand data is telling us. And those two things combined, we're working up what we want the vision for this piece of railway to look like and what kind of services we want to provide, what connectivity options we want to provide, and what investment we want to make over the next 10 to 15 years.
So when did that team, when that role was it created? Is that fairly recent? How long has this integrated role existed?
So the integrated role has existed since earlier this year. Okay,
so it's quite fresh. Yeah,
it's quite fresh. But to be frank, we have worked really closely together as two organisations in the investment space anyway, probably for the last decade. And actually, we've seen some really great stuff out of the collaborative approach and the relationships that we've built over that time. But it hasn't been straightforward, and we have at times had different priorities. We've had to have commercial agreements in place. Network Rail projects might want to do one thing whilst GWR and the customer might want another, and it's been challenging to get those to meet. So we've delivered some really good stuff, but actually what we're seeing now with the teams coming together and us aligning those priorities and the vision is we're already seeing that we're delivering more for customers and we're doing it cheaper. So I've got some really good examples where I can cite already, even though we're only 6 months in, where we've seen real financial savings or savings that the customer will really feel on the ground. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I kind of wanted to there is lots of talk about how GBR is critical for this integration, but as you say, there's been a decade now in the case of Great Western, a decade of integration between track and train, which is a rather crude way of putting it. I much prefer between infrastructure and operations. You might sort of say as much closer ties. I'd love to, you kind of allude to it there, actually. I'd love to kind of explore how that closer integration is working on the ground ahead of GBR, providing us that legal integration, if you like. Clearly, a lot has happened. So you said there are some examples of really successful kind of working. What are those, and how has that looked on the ground? So if I reflect back perhaps to a few years ago, working together as separate organisations, we've achieved some really great stuff across the network. I could talk about station improvements at Newbury, for example. It is my home station, so it is close to my heart, but it is also on the patch and it's really relevant. And actually what we've done there is completely redesigned the forecourt, the station, the facilities that we offer to customers, but we've done it with the local authority. We've secured funding, third-party funding to be able to do that. We've consolidated parking, and we've been able to create a much more, a much nicer space for customers with better facilities, better parking facilities, better cycle facilities. But actually what it's done, more importantly, is it's opened up the ability for jobs, housing and growth in the area. So we've seen already in that small area 300 new residential units being built on a car-free sort of deal, so they don't come with car parking spaces. So actually the station is critical for people to be able to move around and get to work and for leisure, etc.
Doubly beneficial in that case, because not only are you that is a much more sustainable development, so it's the right kind of development that we want to see. Also, it's a revenue. It's almost a guaranteed revenue stream. You're building your revenue stream. This is something that, as a railway, we were quite good at in 100 years ago, or a little more than that. With particularly the Metropolitan Railway was very good at understanding that actually you build your market, you build the houses, you sell off the land to build the houses around the station. You create yourself a market for your railway. So yeah, it's almost like we're relearning some of those skills. Yeah, so Newbury is a really interesting example of that. What about reacting to things not going well? So when there's been disruption, have you found that is because that's a collaboration that has been happening, that close working has happened across the country actually in the last decade, but how has that manifested? As obviously you're looking at the strategic side, but you are, those discussions about the more responsive, reactive stuff, you'll be seeing some of that in action as well.
Definitely, and I'd probably refer to a recent project, actually. I'd probably refer to the Oxford project, which has been in the press loads over the last year and a half, and not for good reason. And unfortunately, the way that the project's progressed and the amount of time we've had the road closed for local residents has been really, really very challenging. But with the teams coming together, what we were able to achieve earlier this year was a blockade of the railway line, and we did some really innovative stuff over that time. So firstly it was easy to agree as an industry rather than batting it back and forth for very many months. But we put in place some quite innovative solutions to be able to get people around the network still. And we brought in a bridge which we laid over the tracks, which allowed non-railway people to use the station as a crossing point because they weren't able to use the road. We had both teams on site there working with customers, giving the same message and treating the customers with the same respect and the way that you'd want customers to be dealt with in those circumstances, which it is quite challenging. Yeah. And actually we got through that blockade in a really, really positive place. And now we're working towards Botley Road, which is the big one, which has been in the press quite a lot, reopening this August, and the two teams are absolutely delivering that customer experience with one voice and in one way and in one style, and we just moved a lot of that friction out of it. Yeah, absolutely, it's absolutely crucial. So there's amidst the talk of kind of running a simpler railway, the reality is that the complexity of stakeholders and their demands makes this challenging. I've popped up the GWR annual customer and stakeholder report because there's quite a lot of viewers. There's a lot that's very interesting in there, so worth getting hold of that and having a flick through. Can you talk about how you're aligning the demands of a very diverse operational railway, its enabling infrastructure, and the needs of the cities and regions that you serve? How do you manage and balance those demands and make sure they're aligned? Yeah, I mean, it is a real challenge, isn't it? Because the obvious answer for some of our stakeholders is we want a new station because that will serve communities and that will give connections that we want. And in lots of cases, we've been able to support that, and that's really, really positive. And again, I can talk through a few examples of that in a moment or two. But we've also got to understand that that's not always the right option. Sometimes we need to look at other more holistic solutions. So is there a better way to integrate the local bus services connections with the stations? Can we timetables so that when a bus arrives, a train goes 10 minutes later? And we're doing a lot of that, particularly down in the southwest and in Devon and Cornwall. But what we are doing is we're listening to stakeholders, and over the course of the next 2 years, we have either delivered or will be delivering 11 new stations. So that's new journey opportunities, feeding new markets. And in many cases, those new stations are serving new housing areas and new development sites, and supporting that kind of economic regeneration in the area. And a really good example of that is the Portishead line reopening, which we're working really hard to deliver currently with local stakeholders, with the West of England Combined Mayoral Authority, and that's really exciting, because that's reopening what was a passenger line back in the 1960s back into passenger use now, and reconnecting those communities that if you want to travel from Portishead to the centre of Bristol at the minute by car, it's only your real viable option. It takes nearly an hour. Yep. When we've reinstated that line, it's down to about 20-25 minutes. Yeah. So it's game changing, and it's that kind of game changing investment that we want to push hard with stakeholders. And I think the way that we've set up our teams now and brought together the regional development alongside the kind of infrastructure delivery means that we're really able to listen to stakeholders and understand what their aspirations are.
Yeah, absolutely. It's yeah, I mean, the challenges of the balance. Of course, the infrastructure people are desperate to have. We'll touch on it a little bit later as well. The balance of climate resilience versus aging assets that require renewal. So, to what extent do some of those renewal plans factor into your strategic work as well? Is that folded into some of the work that you're looking at as well? Do you have sight of that, or is that kept as a entirely separate work stream?
So it has been in the past. It has been, and it's been frustrating because we'll get a renewal come along and do half a canopy roof, and then 2 years later we need to go back and do the other half with some investment that we've got secured locally, and you do it together, and you absolutely would have seen efficiency. I was going to say doubling. You're doubling the site mobilization costs of doing it twice. Yeah, classic. I've seen it as a design engineer. See it all the time. Yeah, absolutely. So that's really important to our strategy going forward, and we're already seeing where we're able to really bring together those. I'm going to call it a blended investment, because the place we're at now is that things like land values in themselves are not going to make a lot of developments commercially viable. So what we need is we need the land values, we need input from the local authorities or stakeholders or third-party developers. And in some cases, we might need some government funding as well. And it's bringing those three together that means that we'll be able to deliver more. And I guess a really good example of that, less so from a third party point of view, but certainly from the perspective of bringing together the renewals investment alongside the enhancement investment, is at a place called Dolphin Junction. I really like Dolphin Junction because I think it's got a lovely name, but it's a big S&C switches and crossing outside of Slough. I know you know that because you're a P-way engineer, but
most of the people watching this know this. I've brought them along with me. They're all a bunch of nerds. They know where they're at. Excellent.
So it's a really big layout just outside of Slough. It's currently 40-mile-an-hour crossovers from mains to reliefs. It's used throughout the day. We've been able to tie in the renewal with securing investment from government to be able to enhance it. So actually this year we'll be increasing those crossovers from 40 miles an hour to 70 miles an hour, which will be quite game changing on the Great Western Main Line in that really key area in the Thames Valley.
It's a point that I try and make as regular as possible with whoever I'm talking to, is that the best way to speed up the railway is to get rid of the slowest bits. It's not to speed up the fastest bits. It's actually, particularly on a line like the Great Western, where you do have lots of converging and diverging sort of junctions, it's making sure that where you've got splitting services, they can split basically as close to line speed as possible. Every time they're braking, that's making a huge gap in your timetable. So yeah, that work is crucial. Yeah, we have battles with that. It's just a constant battle with Network Rail, as you'll know, of the difference between a renewal and an enhancement, and the fact that they have to be treated very, very differently, even though for almost no additional money, almost very little additional capex, you can go from a 25 or a 40 mile an hour switch to a 50 50 or a 60, and all of a sudden smooth that profile and improve that. So yeah, it's really positive to hear that sort of forward thinking happening, not just with a Maverick, but actually that it's being embedded into kind of the business as usual. That's really important. So sorry, go on.
I was just going to, because I think just reflecting on that example, the other thing that I think is positive that we've been able to do across Network Rail and Great Western is to put in place a really robust customer handling plan, because as you can imagine, closing the Great Western for a period of time is really quite traumatic, and there's not many options in the area. We can't throw loads of buses into London. It just won't take it. So actually what we've been doing is working up a whole strategy that means we're able to outstable rolling stock in different locations. We're running long distance diversions into Euston. We're working with people like Southwestern to look at how do we get people to different parts of the network so they can get into London in different ways. We're also dealing with things like big events happening at the same time. So there's lots of customers wanting to move around the network, and we want to keep them moving in the best way possible. And in my mind, that's keeping them on trains as much as we possibly can. And that's been a key sort of objective about bringing this together as kind of track and train using.
And there are a few nice GWR examples of that. I think of the extra electric services being run to Cardiff for when there's a big event in Millennium Stadium, there's Six Nations and things, which has been examples of GWR is quite responsive to that sort of thing. So yeah, it's good to see that being continued at a more strategic level as well, which is really really positive. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about is kind of was acknowledged in the Meyer report prior to the previous general election. Jürgen Meyer's sort of study into urban transit particularly, but also the TUC did a report a little bit earlier about this as well, which is that to hit net zero, the railway needs to essentially double its mode share versus road and air. For various reasons, this often fails to propagate down into regional strategies, and there also remains resistance at a national level to include targets for passenger growth in, for example, the GBR bill. But how is Western, if Western is tackling this and thinking about growth, how is this being tackled at a strategic level, given that kind of political back and forth and the fact that it can be sensitive to particular, characters either within government or within the rail industry? How is that growth piece being managed?
So I think the growth piece for the Great Western is it is absolutely critical. It's our biggest tool to reducing net subsidy and getting the reliance from government funding down. We move more passengers, we make more money. It's good business, right? And it has been a key pillar in our thinking over the last decade, and it continues to be going forwards. And I think there's a couple of things I'd mention. Firstly, I think it's about utilising the train service we've already got to the best of our ability and filling the trains, because we've got some trains that are incredibly full and incredibly busy, and we've seen the growth on the Great Western post-COVID being really strong. It's been particularly strong in the leisure market. Business is good, but the leisure market is particularly strong. But we've still got trains that are running pretty empty. So we're really keen to be able to fill the capacity we've currently got. So that's like the shoulder peaks. Well, how do we move people or get new people into those parts of the timetable that are currently quite quiet? And we're really keen to do that. So that's the first thing to think about. The second one is around the benefits that we've seen unlocked from electrification. So we've now had an electrified railway for, must be 8 years, something like that.
It's like frightening. That was feeling like recent, but it's not recent anymore.
Time absolutely flies, and we've seen from that, we've had significant timetable changes. It's meant we've been able to increase the number of trains that we're operating across the day, and so that's been our kind of key tool in our toolbox over the last decade to see more capacity. But we're now at the point where, okay, that's great, we've done that, we've delivered that, we need to fill the trains that are not quite full, but what's next? And it's the what's next that I'm really interested in. And I think particularly when I think about some of the sort of more regional services, a lot of the trains we've got running down in Devon and Cornwall are very old. they are life expired, and we need to replace them in the next 8-9 years. Certainly by 2035 we're at the point where we've got rolling stock that really shouldn't be going around the network and is not suitable for our customers. So we do now have a whole program established which is looking at kind of the regional fleet replacement, and that will then remove those really old trains from our network, and that will allow us to run longer services. So where we're currently running 2 car, we can then run 3 or 4 or 5 car, and that will give us capacity and allow us to grow the network in that way. So we're really keen to be able to move that piece of work forward. It needs to happen at the same time as the infrastructure side.
I was going to say, as soon as you talk about rolling stock, you have to talk about traction strategy and not just putting wires up, but also power supply as well. So all my power supply friends out there, it's not just putting the wires up. You need to have the right juice going into it, as anyone north of Newcastle knows when there are electric trains running on the diesel, because there's not enough power supply. So yeah, and I suppose tied into that, Joe, I realise I interrupted a little bit there, but tied into that is, to what extent are you allowed to use the E word? To what extent are you being allowed to say, well, actually, we think electrification is the right thing to do to finish the job in some cases, or even to push beyond where the original Great Western electrification boundaries were planned? To what extent are you allowed to assert some of that within your strategizing?
So I think it's in our gift to determine what that looks like, and we have to be, I guess we have to be realistic here, and we're not going to get to a position where the government have got enough money to electrify the whole of the system. Certainly in our lifetimes, I can't see it happening. So what we're trying to do is build a strategy that means we get as much electrification as possible, and then the bits that we can't electrify, whether it's too technically difficult or too expensive, they kind of go hand in hand anyway, we find an alternative solution for. And that's why we're pushing for battery electric trains with kind of discrete bits of electrification, so that we can still run a more sustainable railway, but not rely on wires absolutely everywhere, because it's not going to be suitable for every bit of the network.
Particularly down in Cornwall, where you've got all those little branches and little bits and pieces that are seeing, by the way, a lot of success happening down there. You alluded to earlier the integration between bus and that's been really well done in Cornwall, and sort of southern Devon in that integration piece. But yeah, like, electrification is not going to go up those branches anytime soon. Even if we were charging forwards with a fully funded program, you're just not going to get there anytime soon. So yeah, it is right to be considering that within the fleet picture as well. Yeah.
Yeah, but what we do know is, because we're doing it, we're trialing it, we do know that battery electric trains can work on the network. We've got a trial ongoing on the Greenford branch currently. I've ridden it; it's fun.
In the old D stock, the ex Viva Rail sort of battery. In fact, behind me, wherever this, I've got my GWR lanyard. I've actually got the bona fide sort of, it's fun riding on it.
Excellent, and it shows it works, right? And it might not be the way that we want to go forward delivering the battery electric solution on the rest of the network. It might not be that piece of technology, but I think the thing is, we've proved that it works, and it does work, and it would be perfect for some of those branch lines that you already highlighted down in Cornwall.
It's one of those things where, like, I'm not agnostic. I have skepticism about the extent to which government is leaning on battery. However, even independent of that, there have to be battery trains running. At the moment, we still don't really have just a business as usual. You get the battery train running fleet. The 777s on Merseyrail have had some challenges, although they're kind of bedding in a bit. The 555s up on Tarnower Metro rely on will have some limited, but it's not the case that there are just battery fleets running around everywhere yet. And it's almost like, no, we just need to make that leap and sort of get those trains running. And if you've got a pioneer squadron that kind of fleet that then struggles, then fine, we learn from that. But yeah, I'm always like, okay, let's commit to it. Let's go. Let's get these things running, which is why it's good that it's running on the Greenford branch. But I look forward to that then, snowballing.
Definitely, and it is now in passenger use. So so our customers, despite it being old rolling stock, it's been done up quite nicely.
It's quite smart.
They're quite
fine,
comfortable. Yeah. And so I think it's another example where Great Western and Network Rail Western route have kind of been ahead of the game and really pushing some of this innovation forward. And by innovation, obviously, in this case, I'm talking about technology, but I also use it in terms of the way that we're dealing with investment and third parties and stakeholders across the route as well. And some of our relationships, our relationship with West of England Mayoral combined authority is fantastic. You know, we've secured significant amounts of funding in the kind of greater Bristol area, and we're delivering some really great stuff there, which will hugely contribute to economic regeneration in both Bristol itself, around Bristol Temple Quarter and the station. There's huge amounts going on there, but also, you know, in those other locations out towards Brabazon, Newtown, of course, and Henbury and Portishead. So there's some really great stuff going on there that I think our mature relationship with the combined authority, which has been built up over the last kind of 5, 6, 7 years, has really kind of put us ahead of the game on.
Yeah, absolutely. So we come to some of those bigger, more existential crises and pressures. So, you know, the GWR is a railway very much under direct pressure from global warming and its climatic effects. This creates significant pressure for you, I would imagine, on balancing priorities when budgets are being constrained from above. You know, you see the before and after at Dawlish here, that there was no easy answer to the fact that it just required some serious heavy civil engineering to fix the problem. Is there a risk for a system like Great Western's? Is there a risk that we lose all of our spend on resilience efforts whilst running kind of a diminishing railway when it comes to, renewals or even capacity enhancement? You know, as that work falls behind, as we rightly have to spend more and more to just keep the railway physically intact. You know, how do you square that circle?
Yeah, it's a challenging one, isn't it? I guess in some ways, the challenge that you've highlighted already with our renewals budgets and our enhancements budgets being so separate, that causes us problems at times, but at other times it's an opportunity because it does mean they're effectively ring fence for us to be able to continue doing the enhancements side of the vision at the same time as continuing with the resilience work as well. And I love these pictures that you've got on screen. I think this bit of the railway is really emotive. It's beautiful. Our customers love to use it, and
massive growth as well. This is one of the fastest growing bits of railway from a passenger growth perspective. Exeter is, people don't think of Exeter as a place that has massive growth, but you'll know with the numbers in front of you the growth in ridership in and around the Exeter area is spectacular. I mean, Oakhampton helps, of course, a little bit, but it's so I point out climate resilience, but also that growth piece together in Dawlish area is they're interesting together.
Yeah, and I think just whilst we're on the resilience piece, obviously you've got an example there of some of the work that we've done down there, and of course we're going to continue to face climate change and resilience issues, but the money that we've spent down in the Dawlish area around Teignmouth has really worked, and it's allowed us to keep the railway open. And we saw some severe flooding earlier this year. We had to close the railway for a very short period of time, nothing like the 3 months that we had to close it for when we saw that iconic picture of the tracks swinging in the air. And the work did what it was designed to do, which was make the railway resilient and allow us to reopen it as quickly as possible when it was safe to do so. So it's really positive that it's working and we're allowing people to keep moving. And this is really important for both the local area in Dawlish, but also the southwest and further into Devon and Cornwall, where they rely on this railway line to get out of Devon and Cornwall. Yeah,
absolutely. When I deliver lectures on sustainability and railway sustainability, one of the things I talk about is, when I'm saying sustainability isn't just the green stuff, is pointing out regional inequality and investment. And the southwest does bounce along the bottom of the regional investment kind of graph, if you like, when it's the Southwest, the East Midlands and Northern Ireland, when it comes to the whole UK, traditionally are bouncing along the bottom. That's not a reflection on GWR. That's government priorities across all transport, not just rail. And it shows how important it is that, if the railway is severed, that's already a severe impact on an area that has already has challenges with car dependence and transport poverty. So yeah, it's good. It's getting that balance right is really important.
But Cornwall, for example, and sorry to jump in on you,
no, it's all go for it.
You're my host here. Cornwall are really ambitious. They're really ambitious and they're really passionate about the railway line. And we've just completed a £56 million investment in Mid Cornwall Metro down there, which was funded by Cornwall Council, and that's now allowed for an increase in services. We've got a new platform at Newquay. We've linked it in with better bus connections so that actually you're not just stuck when you get into Newquay, you can then get around. And so there's some, there is a lot of passion and enthusiasm in Cornwall as well, and they're willing to put their money where their mouth is, which I think is really, really important.
I'm going to be paying we're paying very, very close attention to Mid Cornwall Metro. Hopefully there'll be we'll get some good statistics to see how successful that scheme has been, but it's one, along with the Hope Valley sort of tact that's kind of coming on, that's going to be coming online over the next few years. These are some of the really important rural schemes that actually are going to be really important in driving down car dependence in these areas, and show that it isn't just about the cities, that actually the railway can play a key role in rural areas as well. Talking about opportunities, let's talk about growing places. Enabling people to keep moving is essentially the name of the game, whether directly or through providing the goods that they need. But it can get a bit lost in the kind of the incrementalism of growth numbers. The report that you've released recently with Development Economics includes some rather interesting data, and I think it's worth taking a look at. The first question I wanted to ask is, who was your, in pulling this report together, who was your target audience? Who were you writing this report for? Who are you kind of intending to sort of nudge in a direction with this report? Because there's a lot of really interesting stuff in it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, it's a great report, and I really love it because it pulls together everything that we already knew rail did for local economies and regional economies into one place, and starts to really bring it to life with numbers around the value of some of the work that we're doing. So I think it's a great report. There we go. There's some of the stats.
Some of the nice stats. Exactly. Yeah.
And I love to use this with my stakeholders, with potential funders, because it really gives them a flavour of what they might get in return for their investment. So this isn't just about a new station and new connectivity, but it is about jobs. It's about housing. It's about growth. It's about leisure. People going on holiday, people spending money in the economy. And I think this report really brings home the wider benefits of some of the local work that we're doing on the patch. And so I think it's a great report that I basically carry it in my back pocket all the time. Whip it out for stakeholders.
Was there anything that that it came up with that surprised you, that kind of you weren't perhaps expecting to kind of drop out?
I think I don't think there was anything I didn't know about that it's said, but probably the values that it's come up with, the kind of economic value that station-led development can have, the sort of 14.3 billion, this is huge numbers of economic value that station-led development in the Western route can have. And so this isn't just round the edges, this is game-changing for local economies. And I think that for me is the main thing that's really brought out by this report. Yeah,
there are a couple of things that I really liked that I wanted to pull out. That were figures 1.2 and 1.6 for the nerds who've got the PDF open already. But they're kind of basically you have a series of case study stations that you've picked out, and there's a few different methodologies that development economics have used within the report. But the first of them was housing development. We've talked about it. It's a critical part of, if you have sustainable transport led housing development, you are creating the right environment to have sustainable livelihoods. Therefore, you're reducing carbon impact and also generally giving people better lives. So I found that very interesting. So going through and looking at the housing development on between 2020 to 2025, 2026 to 2035, and then 36 to 40. So looking at those lumps, and you can just see the level of housing growth over this period. It's quite, there's a lot of units of housing being developed. That feels like it's interesting comparing where that is happening and where that isn't happening. The other one that I found interesting is looking at the annual permanent effects in the vicinity of GWR stations by sector. So the reason I wanted to talk about this one, I thought this was interesting. So looking at the type of workforce that is using the railway and the type of people who are using the railway, because it's still very much led by office-based activities. Now, that's not a bad thing in and of itself, but for me, it's indicative of that age-old thing that we should, the more diverse a service, or at least the more consistent a timetable is, the more diverse the users can be, because they can start. So, we've always built, as an overall railway, Britain's railway has always been bowler hat toting, umbrella toting, sort of city worker going in and out drumbeat. But we know that people don't all travel like that. Women particularly don't travel in and out necessarily. They're generally, if women as in Britain, the primary sort of caregivers in the household are often making multiple skipping stops in a day when they have multiple journeys. And the railway, if you have a railway that is designed around daily commuting, it doesn't facilitate those needs. So it's quite interesting that we still have a high level of office-based use of the railway, which is good because that's people using it to work. But also it's interesting that we want to increase the diversity. What's the point here is about the economic value of that. So even though retail and leisure are, as you said earlier, leisure travel is climbing, but actually the value is still seen as coming from those office-based activities. Again, that's interesting for the Southwest, given how much tourist potential the Southwest of England has. So I found those quite interesting. And there's a whole scattering of data like that people can chew through. I'm sure other people will come up with other secondary sort of thoughts, but there's a lot in there. What is the report? What are you planning and hoping that the report creates the momentum for or continues to do? You said you've got it in your back pocket and you swing it around at people, but what are you hoping that comes off the back of it and the work that was done for it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, so we've got some stakeholders, local authorities that are already absolutely in the space where they see the value of rail travel for their economies. And so in those cases, I don't need to whip it out of my back pocket. But there's some areas that are perhaps less well connected, perhaps have a lower service frequency on some of their stops. If they're on the main line, then perhaps they don't have intermediate stations, and that's obviously where the interest around new stations comes from. And perhaps they're not yet in the place where they really understand the full value that rail can bring to their local economies and communities. And I think that's where this report is really helpful, and it's to bring some of those stakeholders on board, but also when we're talking to third-party developers. So we do go out and we talk to developers who want to put in place big and develop big housing developments, and that's the point in time where we need to get in there early and say, great, we can help you do that. We can help you unlock your planning challenges if you invest in X, Y, and Z, and here's the benefits of doing so. And I think, reflecting more on the report, really, I think it gives us an opportunity to think more widely about how we look at business cases for investment going forward. In the rail industry, traditionally, we've used the government green book, and that doesn't always take account of some of these much wider economic benefits, which I think are hugely important. Even if you don't see them coming directly back into rail, they are coming back into UK PLC and our economies. I guess I'd probably just talk and reflect a little bit on Oakhampton.
Certainly.
Yeah, so we opened the new rail link to Oakhampton back in 2021. We delivered the scheme pretty quickly for a rail infrastructure, a major rail infrastructure scheme.
In difficult circumstances, given what was going on in 2021. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. And we delivered it under budget, which proves that we can do it.
Yep.
And, we can put in place principles that mean that we can do things more quickly and more efficiently and all the rest of it. But what I find absolutely fascinating about Oakhampton is that the whole business case was based on a forecast passenger use, which we've used all of our tools to predict. But actually, what have we seen since then? Double the number of rail journeys that we ever predicted on that line. So actually, it really shows the power that some of these valuable connections really can have, and the influence that will have on people's journeys and how they choose to make those journeys. So double forecasted passenger numbers in year one, which is phenomenal. But we're also this year about to open Oakhampton Interchange, which is an intermediate station, which is funded by the local authority, which Network Rail and GWR are delivering on their behalf. And that's due to open later this summer. And that then joins up the link to Oakhampton with local business and housing in that area as well. So it's a really nice, neat, tidy example of how these new connections can really unlock growth in the rail industry.
Absolutely, it's a real success story, and it's nice that whenever we have a project that reinstates a railway service, it pretty reliably tremendously exceeds its predicted footfall. It's maybe something for our consultancy class, of which I used to be one, to pay a little bit closer attention to there. But Joe, that's been a really interesting conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Very welcome. Thank you.
GBR was officially kick-started back on the 20th of May 2021, long over half a decade ago now. It has taken us this long and we cannot screw it up. Chatting with Joe shows us how everything the current GBR is saying it will enable has been possible for a decade already, which is why we need deeper change. But that change cannot happen overnight, and we should not be disheartened when the structure is not perfect from day one. For last week's bonus episode, Ben Plowden, the CEO of the Campaign for Better Transport, had this to say on his experience of being right at the heart of TfL as it made a similar journey.
Very similar process. The GLA Act 1999 created the legal entity of the Mayor of London, the GLA and TfL. Something like 30 predecessor organisations were sort of thrown into a cardboard box called TfL, and TfL was written on the side. But that was not a functioning organisation, not a problem, not a criticism of any of the people involved. It was just 30 organisations all put under one brand. So over the intervening 10, 15, 20 years, that organisation moved from being 30 separate organisations into being, I would say, a highly functioning, world-leading urban transport authority. But it did not happen overnight, and literally could not have happened overnight. And it's not the same now structurally as it was in 2000, 2001. Now, it shouldn't take as long as that took, hopefully, for GBR, but it's not going to be a couple of years, I would say. And in that period, the organisation is going to need to be allowed to evolve, to experiment, to try stuff out, to change its operating model, to change its governance, to change how it does what it does, because it will get better at being GBR with every year that passes, right? But I think recognising that's a complex process that takes time involving human beings is going to be really important to allow GBR to become the organisation it needs to be.
Of course, there is one last change I'll be making to GBR. Branding should always be as simple and clear as possible, dispensing with any superfluity. And there's simply no improving on what we've already perfected. But what do you think? There's a lot of detail in here, but also a lot of things that I've barely touched on. Do you agree with me? What do you think about Transport for England as an organisation? Let me know in the comments. To talk all things branding, I'll see you for the bonus. But in the meantime, thanks so much for watching. Cheerio! We can't end episode 314 without talking about the bloody class 314, right? That's just how it is. These trains are interesting, not so much in and of themselves, although they're perfectly capable suburban trains or urban trains, but more about what they represented, because these were a new fleet procured for the excitingly reopened Argyll line in 1979. Part of Glasgow's fantastic railway, suburban railway transformation. So for that alone, they're an honoured guest on this episode. But also, they lasted a blinking long time, did they? Only replaced very, very recently with those new electrics. Anyway, the 314.